insulin resistance is, evolutionary speaking, a good thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because
adaptive.
It's adaptive. Because whenever I'm in very, very strict ketosis, afterwards or during that time, I'm insulin resistant because my body wants to preserve that little glucose that is available for my brain and my heart and my blood cells. So insulin resistance is always, we think about it as a general insulin resistance, but insulin resistance basically means that your muscles become insulin resistant because they can burn fatty acids, they can burn proteins, they don't need the glucose. So we preserve the glucose for the brain. And that's when we get, in women, you often get diabetes during pregnancy. And that's a similar mechanism. Nature wants to preserve the little glucose we might have during starvation or during carbohydrate shortage for the baby. The developing baby needs a lot of glucose. So the mother turns insulin resistant, so the baby survives. So in that case, I think there's evidence to suggest, at least some studies, that a migraine patient also turns insulin resistant. But it might not be the cause of migraine. It might be the body compensating that hypoglycemia, turning the rest of the body insulin resistant to preserve the little glucose there is for the brain.
Well, really great to be with you, Elena. We did a quick Facebook Live yesterday, and you were talking about migraines, and you've done a lot of research into migraines in your PhD thesis, I believe, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing, and some of the things you were telling me. But you have a wealth of knowledge. You can talk about heavy metals and heavy metal burden and exogenous ketones. So I don't know where the conversation is going, but first of all, how many people suffer from migraines? I mean, have you looked at the epidemiology to see, like, it's pretty...
Yeah, it's quite profound. So actually, heavy metals, no, migraines.
Yeah.
Sorry, we just talked
We're
about
at a
heavy
conference,
metals. We're tired, so I still have that in mind. There's 1 billion migraine patients in the world, so almost every 7th person suffers from migraine or has suffered from migraine at some point in their lives. And it's actually the most common neurological disease in the world and the 3rd most common disease in general. So the 3rd most common disease is migraines, and we know so little about it. And compared to other diseases, there's so little research money actually going into understanding what migraines are. What is the pathophysiology? Where does it come from? How can we treat it? Only in very recent years there has been more research interest into migraines, and it's not so much stigmatized anymore, and people actually believe you that it's a debilitating disease and not just a headache. So migraine is so much more than just the pain. There's a lot of associated symptoms such as nausea, light, noise, smell sensitivity. It gets worse with moving. It's one-sided. Some people get word-finding difficulties or even until paralysis. Sorry. So yeah, and the fatigue is really bad as well.
Post-migraine fatigue. And
Pre, post, during.
Wow.
So there's 3 phases to a migraine attack, and you can actually get them isolated. So the prodrome is basically when you get the fatigue, the yawning, feeling off, feeling lightheaded, and you can kind of feel that something is happening, something is coming, and then you have the headache phase, and then you have the release afterwards, the post-drome phase. And during the beginning, a 3rd of the migraine patients even get an aura phase where they completely lose vision in one part of the visual field, or they see zagged lines, or part of the body gets paralyzed in a bit more seldom cases. But
wow, that would be so frightening.
It's quite a scary thing.
It must be the scariest thing. And the traditional remedies, we don't have to take a super deep dive, but are they more superficial? Do they address any of the core metabolic and oxidative stress imbalances?
So traditional medicine now is thinking that migraines are more like a neurovascular problem, maybe a neurogenetic problem, but only very recently, well, that's not true. About 50 to 100 years ago, migraines were called hypoglycemic headache. So people had already figured out that there's a connection between energy metabolism and migraines. But then, a bit like in epilepsy, where they completely forgot about the ketogenic diet, they forgot about that part, and they focused completely on hyperexcitability and other aspects of the migraine brain, which you can target with traditional or with a standard pharmacological way of looking at things.
Right.
Pharma also is always, or mostly, is a monotherapy, meaning that they find one target that is causing a disease, and then they target that one pathway or whatever that is, right? And migraines, like a lot of chronic multisystemic diseases, is a multigenic disorder, meaning that a lot of small polymorphisms or mutations in very different genes will add up to cause migraines in some way. And that's true for so many of those new chronic civilization diseases. It's not a monogenetic disease where you know that, okay, if this function is lost, you get this disease. And in that sense, it makes sense to then find a drug that targets that one pathway and completely cures the disorder. But that's not the right way to look at chronic civilization diseases because they don't have one target. And what all migraine drugs do, well, first of all, when it comes to prevention of migraine, you'll have only substances until very recently that are borrowed from different diseases. You give them antidepressants, you give them anti-epileptics, you give them beta blockers. So basically treatments borrowed from other diseases that have accidentally been found to reduce migraine frequency just a little bit, just enough to be significant. It might help reduce migraine frequency for a little while. Then you get used to it, you have to up the dose, and the side effects will also increase, obviously. Mm-hmm. So it's not really an option. I've tried all of these things for my migraines.
Oh, so you get them personally? Is that how you got interested?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I had chronic migraines. So now even the acute treatment, it's symptomatic treatment. You basically take the pain away. Triptans, painkillers, you stop the pain. But there's neuroimaging studies that show that those brain areas that we see that light up during a migraine, mm-hmm. they remain active when you abort the migraine with the standard migraine abortive drug, the triptans. So these brain areas remain active, which basically means the migraine is still ongoing. We're just suppressing the pain.
Wow.
And there's this new migraine vaccination stuff coming out now, CGRP monoclonal antibodies that Novartis and other large pharma companies are now producing that have been shown to be efficacious. They target one neuropeptide that is also involved in pain transmission. So even those that are taking preventative injection-based, they just suppress the action of that one neuropeptide that is involved in the pain. But they don't look at the root cause of migraine. And that's probably because a lot of pharma people, maybe they haven't figured out what the root cause of migraine could be. Mm-hmm.
And we kind of talked about that yesterday. I mean, it seems like you said it's multifactorial. There's multiple. Is there different subtypes of migraines, or are they kind of all the same?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in our diagnosis now, there is a few subtypes that we know, like vestibular migraine, if you have a problem with orienting in space and you feel like falling down all the time, or you get very clumsy before, that's vestibular migraine. Then we have migraine with or without aura, that's a traditional classification, which is basically just do you get visual disturbances before your migraine starts. So that's a very easy to distinguish migraine. And then you have a few others, like is it chronic, is it episodic, but there's probably so many more clinical subtypes that we don't distinguish yet. Sure. And that could be maybe distinguished with individual trigger factors. For example, there's menstrual migraine, which is another one where you know that if it's starting just prior to your period, then it's a menstrual migraine. So these are the easy things to classify the subtypes of migraine with, in the absence of any biomarkers. So since there aren't any biomarkers, it's really hard to further subdivide the migraine patient in a very, let's say, objective way.
Can anyone with a brain get a migraine? I mean, basically,
that's another great question.
Let's say I personally am 36, never had a migraine. Can I do enough bad stuff or whatever that I can cause myself to get a migraine?
I think so, and this is a very fascinating thing. I believe that migraines are an adaptive response of the brain to something bad that happens, and we will go into more details about this, but just to answer your question, I think everybody has an individual threshold for migraines, and if you were getting, a traumatic brain injury, right, and you have a severe concussion, right, you don't get enough energy into your brain, you don't get enough oxygen, you might develop a migraine.
As a compensatory way to repair the brain.
Exactly. So in my opinion, migraines are an energy deficit syndrome and an adaptive response towards a severe energy crisis in the brain that can be triggered by either oxidative stress levels being too high or hypoglycemia in a way, or hypometabolism. And it's quite fascinating that there's studies now that show, using brain imaging, that even between migraine attacks, a migraineur's brain has 20% less ATP on average than a healthy person. And that's just between attacks. Wow. So during an attack, this might be even more profound. And there's several studies that also show hypometabolism, so there's just less glucose in the brain at a given time point. And and more other research is accumulating, like increased oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in general. That also the genes that we find, there's some genes that suggest that mitochondrial dysfunction plays a role with migraine. And we also know that the migraine brain is a little bit special in the sense that it's hyper-responsible. So if a healthy person, like I mentioned yesterday, is looking at a wall like this or any stimulus that isn't changing, a healthy brain encodes change. And that's an adaptive response. It makes sense that if nothing is changing, we're not wasting energy on signaling something that's always there. Similar to the brain doesn't, not like a computer. If you look at a computer is so bad at distinguishing or recognizing a cat, right? Or recognizing any stimulus. We're so efficient at that within seconds. And one of the reasons is that we recognize the borders of things and then we just fill everything in. A computer is basically encoding every spot, even though if it's all white, it will encode every dot. Right. And we'll just encode the borders, then we see, oh, it's white in there, and we just fill the rest in. So a brain encodes change, but a migraine brain doesn't necessarily. If a migraine brain is looking at a stimulus that isn't changing, it will keep firing. And so that makes it just so much more energy demanding. And I think this is why a migraine's brain or a person that gets migraines frequently is so vulnerable to this metabolic stress, because it just constantly has a higher demand. And if you look at migraine from an evolutionary standpoint, something that is so common must have had an evolutionary advantage. There's no way that migraines or the migraine genotype does not confer any evolutionary advantage if it's 15% of the population suffering from that. So I think that it's just that 10,000 years where carbohydrates became increasingly available is just not enough for everybody to perfectly adapt to that change, to that metabolism, to that carbohydrate-rich metabolism. So if you have a migraine-prone genotype with a very hyper-responsive brain, and you also have a fairly, say, suboptimal carbohydrate metabolism genetic background, and you put the two together, getting migraine is just basically predisposed.
From a genetic standpoint.
From a genetic standpoint, exactly. And so, I wanted to say, I don't know, I lost my train of thought.
That's really fascinating. So maybe a genotype, maybe if you look at maybe Japanese or something along those lines, where there's a lot of carbohydrates consumed historically based upon seasonal availability and so forth, and then maybe mix them with, say, someone who's Norwegian, for example. A genotype like that may be more susceptible to a migraine, potentially because of the metabolic milieu.
Exactly. I don't know if it was the Neanderthals that were less adapted to carbohydrate metabolism. And it could be that the more Neanderthal genetics you have, it's between, I think, 1% and 4%. So the more you have from them, you're better at fat metabolism. Neanderthals were very good at fat and protein metabolism. So the more you have of that, the less good you're going to be with carbohydrates. But I just wanted to say that, so those people that might watch and have migraines or know people that have migraines, there is an advantage having that hyperexcitable brain, or they used to be. Migraineurs tend to be perfectionists, which can be good or bad. But if you think about a tribe and a tribe of people, and there was, I don't know, maybe there's 70 people to a tribe, out of these 10 would have had a hyperexcitable brain. Now, if they sleep around the campfire and there's hyperexcitable brains also sleeping there, they will be the first ones to wake up when there's a tiger coming. So a hyperexcitable brain doesn't get in sleep so deeply, or they hear louder, they smell more. It's incredible. Just before a migraine attack, I can smell things from almost not kilometers, but it's incredible.
Wow.
People, things. Everybody thought I'm crazy and I couldn't possibly smell these things, but then when things get closer, I'm usually right. So
is it like 12 hours or 5 hours? Like, give me the timeline.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Maybe 4 hours, 4 to 10 hours, but it can be up to 24 hours before a migraine attack that you can feel it coming, and you become hypersensitive. And also with light, that's why migraineurs hate white light so much, because they're just so much more sensitized. Sensitized meaning that it needs less of a stimulus to reach the sensory organ to make action potentials. And if you just need less of a stimulus, then more of a stimulus is actually quite painful or not really nice, because your neurons just fire so much quicker.
So like you go into like an outdoor concert or something would be too much?
In a migraine attack, certainly.
Okay.
Now, my migraine threshold has been raised a lot, and through metabolic therapies, other therapies. So now I can go into a concert if I'm not pre-migraine, I'm fine. I might still prefer it if I have some earplugs, you know, but I would tolerate it. And also now I really love those blue blocker glasses.
Yeah.
And I still hate this like bright neon light. It's the worst. But then even in a healthy person, there's research to suggest that blue light is increasing oxidative stress not only in the eye, but in the mitochondria. So the blue light gets through your skin.
Wow.
And increases oxidative stress in the mitochondria, which again means you make less ATP. So too much of this white blue light is probably bad for everyone. But if you then have a genotype, whenever there's a mismatch between oxidative stress and your antioxidant capacity, you're going to suffer. That your mitochondria will not perform perfectly, and you will then you will increase your risk for basically any disease that you can think of, at least civilization diseases. So in migraines, the antioxidant capacity might also be genetically compromised. So you can catch those free radicals less well. So some healthy person might get away with a lot of more oxidized food, blue light, all of these triggers or environmental expositions. And a migraine patient, that might be too much. You get into the energy deficit, and then you get a migraine. Why do you get a migraine? A lot of people say, or I learned in my degree that chronic pain has lost its warning function. So acute pain is a warning signal, but when you have a disease where you have chronic pain, like a migraine, it's a chronic pain state, it doesn't have a warning function anymore. But I think it certainly does. So when your brain gets into an energy crisis, it makes total sense to turn on this very potent alarm signal, which is a migraine you cannot ignore, which then forces you to rest.
Change your behavior. I see.
A migraine pain, what do a migraine person wants to do when they get a migraine? They want to go in a dark room, no sensory stimulation. Doesn't mean you don't need to spend that energy to decode that sensory signal. No noise, no smell. Rest, movement makes it worse. So you just want to die as still as possible until energy homeostasis has been restored.
Wow.
And what's very interesting, those very early studies that I was talking about, they found that, I think 50 years ago, and nobody's heard about those studies, is when they measured ketogenesis and cortisol and glucose at the beginning of a migraine attack, they found that triglycerides and ketone bodies are elevated at the beginning of an attack. So the brain is sensing that energy shortage, and they are already taking, compensatory actions to restore energy homeostasis. But if you in the modern world now just start taking triptans and potent painkillers, and then you start moving about again, you still have that energy deficit in your brain somewhat, but since you're pain-free, you can basically do whatever you could before. So I'm not sure that's the best thing to actually treat your migraines, is riding over that warning signal.
Wow, this is really fascinating. Now, is there a propensity from people with migraines to then develop Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases later in life? I mean, maybe the data is not there.
That's a good question. I know that the risk for depression is increased. But that's, anything that is constant pain, of course, is not going to make you the happiest person in general, right? Because it sucks, and you can't do social activities, and so I know that is the case. I'm not sure anybody's looked at the correlation between Alzheimer's and migraine. It would be very interesting, because you'd think that
with the brain hypometabolism.
Exactly. What is interesting though is what people have looked at is that migraine risk goes down tremendously or quite dramatically in diabetics. You would think, why is that? Well, why is that? Because they just have higher blood sugar levels.
Oh, no,
right? And insulin resistance, and that's also something that people are sometimes not aware of, or it's not so much talked about. Insulin resistance is, evolutionary speaking, a good thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because
it's
adaptive. Because whenever I'm in very, very strict ketosis, afterwards or during that time, I'm insulin resistant, because my body wants to preserve that little glucose that is available for my brain and my heart and my blood cells. So insulin resistance is always, we think about it as a general insulin resistance, but insulin resistance basically means that your muscles become insulin resistant because they can burn fatty acids, they can burn proteins, they don't need the glucose. So we preserve the glucose for the brain. And that's when we get, in women, you often get diabetes during pregnancy. And that's a similar mechanism. Nature wants to preserve the little glucose we might have during starvation or during carbohydrate shortage for the baby. The developing baby needs a lot of glucose. So the mother turns insulin resistant, so the baby survives. So in that case, I think there's evidence to suggest, at least some studies, that a migraine patient also turns insulin resistant. But it might not be the cause of migraine. It might be the body compensating that hypoglycemia, turning the rest of the body insulin resistant to preserve the little glucose there is for the brain. And what we see in our study, in those first patients that have been undergone, we looked at HbA1c, so 3 months glucose average, and they were so low. I've never seen it. So migraine is probably, like they said 100 years ago, a hypoglycemic problem or a problem with glucose metabolism and an energy shortage. And if you look at all the trigger factors that we know that cause migraine, they can all be related to oxidative stress increase. For example, the pill. Few people have made that connection. A contraceptive pill given to teenage girls, and you correlate that with the onset of their migraine. Half a year to a year later, they're developing the migraine, all the migraines are getting much worse. And I try to figure out why that might be the case, and I found some studies to suggest that on average, half a year to a year later, after contraceptive pill intake, oxidative stress increased by 50%. That's massive.
Why?
I don't know why.
Okay.
I have a hypothesis why that might be. So, an oral contraception is not bioidentical hormones. It's basically a substance that mimics bioidentical hormones in a specific way, but cannot replace the function of our hormones completely. Right. But bioidentical hormones, our female hormones, they have a lot of variety of different roles other than just being the
estrogen
female
receptor signaling.
Exactly the female hormone aspect of it, right? And estrogen, for example, is very antioxidant. That's something we also don't know. So if you have too little estrogen to compensate for oxidative stress, you might also get a migraine. So premenstrual migraine happens when estrogen plummets. Now with an artificial contraceptive pill, your endogenous production of female hormones plummets.
Right.
The body doesn't make anymore because it thinks there's enough. So I guess that you don't have enough of the real stuff to be antioxidant.
I see.
And then you have this increase in actually oxidation of lipids, DNA, whatever. And that's really something that we've seen in the talks.
Yeah.
ROS, reactive oxygen species, play a role in almost any disease.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because Eleanor Rogan, does that name ring a bell? She's at University of Nebraska, and she talks a lot about these estrogen-created quinone adducts. And so, long story short, estrogens can be metabolized and almost like hemoglobin can be glycosylated. Estrogen can be metabolized into these quinones that are directly mutagenic to DNA and can deplete glutathione and so forth as the body's way to compensate for that. So it ties into what you were talking about.
That fits perfectly.
That's
interesting.
So anyway, I think that's super fascinating stuff, but getting into how potentially a ketogenic diet or use of ketones, MCT oil, things like that might mitigate the onset of a migraine. Is it primarily based to provide the brain the alternative fuel supply so that in context of low glycemic or glycemic dysregulation, that at least you have the ketones for the neurons to realize that there's enough energy there that they don't need to freak out and create a migraine?
Exactly. So I think this is one of the major aspects. So there's different things that we know play a role in migraine, which is inflammation. We have this hyperexcitability aspect. We have the hypoglycemia or hypometabolism aspect, right? And we have this increased oxidative stress. We have mitochondrial dysfunction potentially. So one thing that ketones definitely do is they can bypass GLUT1 transporters, so the transport system that gets glucose into the brain, right? So if you have a problem with glucose transport or utilization, it can provide a very effective alternative energy substrate for the brain. So that's definitely number one. Its action as a metabolite, we say, right? Just being there to basically supply the brain cells with enough fuel to function. But then ketone bodies just do so much more. One other aspect before we get into the signaling effects that keto bodies can do is sometimes for some patients that are not that severely affected, it's already enough to go on a low glycemic diet, because then at least you'll have stable blood sugar and you don't have these crashes. Because what we see, again, very, very early studies in migraine showed that if you give a migraine patient a glucose tolerance test, you give 50 to 100 grams of glucose on an empty stomach, 50% actually develop a migraine within the next 8 hours.
Wow.
So it's like one of the most potent migraine triggers is giving glucose. So they're literally glucose intolerant. And one of the things that I find is that they basically have a delayed insulin response. So if insulin doesn't, usually it's a bit like a thermostat, right? You have the sugar that goes up, so the body kind of estimates how much is it going to be. It sends some insulin in to bring it back down. Then if that is not enough, it sends some more, and it's kind of regulating like a thermostat. In the migraine patient, it's like it's got this delayed hyperinsulinemia, so it doesn't sense the glucose right at the beginning. It sends too little, then it sends too much insulin, and then your blood sugar drops below to the level it's been before. And this delayed hypoglycemia is probably one of the causes why you might develop a migraine with this glucose tolerance test. So it's already a great step to just get rid of those glucose fluctuations caused by reactive hyperinsulinism. So a low glycemic index, low carb diet can already help just stabilizing the blood sugar level. If you still have migraines and you've tried that, you can take out you can take out dairy, which can be pro-inflammatory for some people. You can play around with that. Take out the gluten, that helps too. If migraines are still around, then it might be good for at least for a period of time, try ketosis. And ketone bodies have been shown to be signaling molecules. That means they can also, in addition to supplying the brain with an efficient energy source, they reduce inflammation. They can reduce hyperexcitability via quite a lot of different mechanisms, which is quite fascinating. So, for example, they shift the balance between GABA and glutamate towards GABA. So GABA is the neurotransmitter that's going to relax things. And then you have increased mitochondrial biogenesis. Mitochondria are the energy factories of the cells, which is good. If you have more factories, you're likely to have more energy. And they reduce oxidative stress. And they also, once you burn them, they produce less oxidative stress while being burned. So it's like a cleaner source of fuel. And there's other things that they do, like they increase the number of glucose transporters being expressed, we say. So you have more transporters to transport glucose into the brain, which is also good to prevent hypoglycemia. And so the good thing about this ketogenic approach is that there's so many different mechanisms that they influence positively, that even if your migraine does not have anything to do with, let's say, inflammation or hyperexcitability, you can target a lot of other pathways that could still be migraine protective. So it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for quite a large percentage of migraineurs if this only nutritional approach. And if that then still isn't enough because your liver isn't making enough ketones, or because you're stressed, if you're stressed, cortisol rises. A migraine is a very stressful scenario for the body, so cortisol is way high in a migraine as well. You can then add some exogenous ketones if you have a good source. MCT during an attack, maybe not. It's a lot of stress for the liver again.
Right. The liver has to compensate. Yeah.
The liver has to do something to make the ketone.
Yeah.
In that case, maybe more like a ketone body salt, which is like instant ketosis for your brain to get it like within 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That might work. So that's what we see in the trial, in the pilot data, that even only the salts on top of a normal diet, which I don't recommend, just to put that out there, but even that reduced migraine frequency by 50% with a not very potent solution. That's
pretty
better
fascinating.
than a drug can do.
Drug companies probably don't want to hear that, but you talked about the insulin response, and I've been diving more into the phase 1, phase 2 insulin response, and it seems that when we hear about blood sugar levels rising, we think that it's just like an all or nothing. The pancreas kind of releases insulin and that's kind of it. But it seems that there's these different phases, and there's a lot more kind of homeostatic regulatory feedback loops going on. And I think that's kind of interesting. So it seems that this really, like a migraine, it manifests that the main symptom is like, cognitive issues and you can't focus, and you want to be isolated essentially, right? But it's like, it seems that this is peripheral, like the causes of this are more peripheral, potentially like in the pancreas or the feedback loops that regulate energy balance.
Yeah, so the original cause could really be peripheral. If your body doesn't make enough glucose for the brain, then obviously your brain will stop. But it's like, it depends on where you say is the root cause. Is the root cause in the genetics, or are you talking about the trigger of the effect? The trigger of the attack is probably peripheral, or if you could even say it's environmental. So if you say that your trigger was doing exercise, which is a potent migraine trigger, exercise,
is that right?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's
30%.
a bummer. So
Because
then people are
why
afraid
not?
of exercise because
They can't exercise. See, I could not exercise. 10 minutes into a run, migraine starts. Because obviously, exercise does two things. It increases oxidative stress, which you don't have the capacity to buffer, and it uses up a lot of energy, so that there's not enough for the brain.
Man.
So, yeah, exercise is one of the most potent migraine triggers, especially the high-intensity one, but also lower grade. So you have to fix your metabolism. Otherwise, exercise is really dangerous for you. Sport is not good for everyone.
Yeah.
If you can't buffer the oxidative stress that is created, and that was something I wish somebody had told me, like, 10 years ago. I was always pushing myself to do exercise, and I didn't want to believe it, and I thought exercise is so good for everyone, but I was probably making things worse, because then your DNA gets damaged because of the oxidative stress that is around, and you feel shit, and you feel like getting a flu, and you're getting migraine, and then you're out 3 days. And so if exercise is one of your triggers, that's one of the best indications that a metabolic therapy is for you.
That makes sense. So you can kind of figure out what's going to be more effective.
Exactly. And
That's a
then
good
once
tip.
you've keto adapted and you do exercise, of course your ketone body levels will drop a little bit because of the cortisol and the gluconeogenesis, but it's probably going to be still enough to fuel your brain, especially if you don't do the high intensity interval training. But if you do more, like, you can lift weights, that's like short impulses,
Rest
right?
in between. Yeah.
Rest in between. Your storage gets restored. You produce some more glucose, and then you go weightlifting again. I wouldn't recommend high intensity interval because it's just so much metabolic strain
There's a lot
over
of
a
surges
longer period, and you don't really have a rest. You
Yeah.
usually still do some kind of low grade
In between.
activity in between. The study suggests it's really good for a healthy person, but for a migraine patient, maybe not the right type of exercise. But play around. If it works,
Yeah, do
it works, right?
Yeah.
If you get a migraine, don't do it. Especially also fasting. There's another interesting study that I stumbled across for the review paper I was writing, which is that migraineurs tend, or in the study at least, they had glucagon resistance. Glucagon is the antagonist of insulin. So whenever you're fasting, you're relying on glucagon to basically get your levels of ketosis going and to get your gluconeogenesis going. If you're resistant to glucagon, you're going to do very bad in a fasted state because you're just not going to make any energy. So if you fasting makes you feel really shit, then chances are you shouldn't be doing it. And then you will find other ways to stay healthy. Even if you do a ketogenic diet and you don't fast, it's probably still going to be good for you. So I now have learned whatever people say, listen to your body. It's probably going to know best what's best for you.
Absolutely. How do you overcome or mitigate glucagon resistance? Is there any strategies?
It's a good question, but I think glucagon resistance, I would suggest you overcome that by giving the body enough fuel, enough energy that it actually needs. So that if glucagon, like insulin, you get insulin resistant if insulin levels are too high all the time, right? Now, if you're all the time in energy deficit and glucagon is around all the time, at some
cells
point,
are gonna start
the body starts to get resistant to that signal because it's around all the time. So the ideal scenario to become glucagon sensitive, I think, is for glucagon not to be elevated all the time, which is going to happen when you fuel your body in the right way. Glucagon is going to come down. So in that sense, I would stay away from fasting, because during fasting, glucagon is elevated again.
Right.
So in a way, with the migraine, which I find quite interesting, it's kind of the opposite of other metabolic diseases we see. Like diabetes is migraine protective.
Which seems crazy. Yeah.
So it's basically it's the opposite side of the coin. We don't have insulin resistance, or if we do, we have it because we are kind of in a fasted, starving state, and we have glucagon resistance. Because we're having too little blood sugar all the time and not too high. So it's quite interesting. And even with obese migraine patients, the risk of migraine isn't increased. The prevalence isn't increased with increasing weight. And that's something we don't see in other diseases either.
Wow. So fascinating.
It's cool, right?
And it affects so many people, and I mean, the loss of productivity. I mean, this would be really, and then what I was wondering is like with panic attack, or anxiety. Like it seems like the brain gets good at becoming better at becoming more anxious, or becoming better at having a panic attack. Does the brain get better at like once you have one migraine, is it like they come more and more and more, or
it could be, at least with the migraine, that whenever I'm treating my migraines with triptans also, I have to admit, because the pain is just so annoying, and it really wears you down. So I'm taking triptans and acute medication now when I get an attack, which isn't that often anymore. But then I can see that if I don't really try and rest up and give my brain the rest to restore homeostasis, they do come back, and they come back for a number of days. So they're easier to come back once they've started. It's kind of like that threshold of the environment has changed, and then once they're gone for good, the threshold rises again. It's harder to elicit a next attack.
Right.
But one attack following the other, basically, or maybe a long rebound migraine is quite common. I'm not sure if they...
Can you read or anything? Like, I would have a hard time just sitting there not doing anything in a dark room for like 12 hours. Can you read or do anything when you have a migraine?
No,
or you're just
if you don't take painkillers or anything, you literally cannot do anything. You can hardly find the words to like form a sentence.
Wow. So it forces you.
It's such bad pain and nausea and sensitivity at the same time. You can only lie there still and just wait until it's gone.
That would just be horrendous. I couldn't ever imagine.
Cold helps because it activates some pain, some analgesic pathways. So you can put some pain. You put the pain so cold that it basically numbs you. But a person without migraine would be like, oh my god, this hurts. It's so cold. But the other pain is actually nicer. I used to bump my head against the wall when I was little because the bumping pain was less than the migraine pain, and that would kind of like cancel the migraine pain out for a bit. But
that's amazing.
Probably something you shouldn't be doing.
Wow,
That's not something I recommend. But sometimes pressure helps. But so nowadays I try when I feel the attack coming, and a lot of patients might know their migraine so well that they get this feeling when the migraine is coming, like the premonitory phase that we've talked about. If you then take exogenous ketones, high dose, that also have magnesium, which is good, you can sometimes abort the attack and it doesn't even happen. I had, because I presented this poster, I had a person coming to me this morning that said, oh, I was jet lagged, I could feel the migraine coming this morning, and I talked to you yesterday, I took exogenous ketones from the conference right at the onset, and 30 minutes later it was gone.
That's so amazing.
So that's quite cool. I mean, I'm not an advocate of trying to use other substances or chemicals to overcome something that you can overcome with diet, but I also feel like the downside of having a migraine is probably worse than taking some exogenous ketones, even if they haven't been tested for like 10 years of safety.
Right.
But it's if you take the DBHB, so the right spinning one, not the racemic synthetic one, it's an endogenous molecule. I don't think safety is going to be the biggest issue on those.
Right.
And we're now completing that clinical trial, phase 2 clinical trial, with migraine and exogenous ketones, and so far there have been absolutely no safety concerns. It's only a 3 months intervention, but they're taking quite high dose, 20 grams of BHB salts per day for 3 months, and the markers we look at for safety basically haven't changed.
Wow.
So.
Amazing. Elena, we could talk all day. I mean, you have a wealth of knowledge. I think we'll be future part 2 talking about heavy metals, because you have a unique experience with heavy metal toxicity and detoxification.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful. I mean, words just flow off the tip of your tongue. People are going to hit the rewind button, I'm sure. Now, folks, I'll put links to the videos, the references and the reviews that you discussed during this podcast right below here in the YouTube description. But if folks want to connect with you, where can they do so?
The best would probably be either YouTube. I upload some videos once in a while if a lot of questions come up frequently. I make a video, so you can just leave me a comment if there's a specific question you want answered. I'm gonna make a video when I can. Then there's Twitter. I've only just used that, but I try and post like if there's new research findings on migraine, heavy metals, or something keto metabolism related. You will find that there. So if you follow me on Twitter, it's Elena, ELENAC for Caroline, and then Gross, GROSS there.
Okay.
And LinkedIn would work as well.
Cool.
Facebook, now I'm overrun with friendship requests, it's probably not the best. I cannot hit accept soon.
That's right.
Facebook is probably not the best because I don't check that other folder very frequently, so that's maybe not the best place to reach me. But those 3 other sources,
awesome. I'll put those below as well. Thanks so much for your
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, so we're here in Long Beach, California, at the Metabolic Health Summit. I didn't say that right.
You said that
Did
right.
I say it right? Yeah, so I really, we've been in indoor light, and so, things are not really, my brain is not, honest.
My brain isn't either, and it's been so many fascinating talks and so many colleagues that you're trying to catch up with, and so you're talking constantly, right?
I'm starting to
and
forget
listening
things. Yeah, but you have a wealth of knowledge. I'm super excited.
Light deprived.
Yeah.
And, but it's been exciting to talk to you. Next time, maybe we talk about heavy metals, which is also certainly one contributor to migraines, because they increase oxidative stress so much. So it's something to look out for if you want to stay.
I would love to talk more
healthy
about that.
and live long. I guess.
Yeah.
And
toxicity is a big deal. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for
so
watching,
much.
guys.
Bye,
Catch
guys.
you on the next one.